and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azawi. The powerful bombs that struck Baghdad and other Iraqi cities in the last few weeks have shattered the myth of improved security. In the aftermath of the horrific explosions, fingers of responsibility were directed not only at Al-Qaeda and the Ba'ath Party, but have also included the political differences among the ruling coalition. One thing is certain, more future explosions can never be ruled out. And if the prediction of one of our guests is right, the worst is yet to come.
Yet again, bombs exploded and rocked Baghdad. Over 100 people were killed on what the Iraqis now call Black Wednesday. 2 trucks with over a ton of explosives detonated 3 minutes apart. The targets, among others, were the finance and foreign ministries, both symbols of the Iraqi government. The news of such a security breach sent shockwaves throughout the country, and allegations of it being an inside job. Some of the security personnel manning the checkpoints were rounded up for questioning, and the usual suspects were named as the real culprits behind the bombings.
We have to declare war on those who implement the agendas of other countries.
Prime Minister al-Maliki accused Iraqi Ba'athists based in Syria for the bombings and had the confessions to prove it.
A month ago, Sattam Farhan, my boss from Syria, who belongs to the group headed by Muhammad Yunus al-Ahmed, contacted me. He called me and told me about a plan to destabilize the government.
Al-Maliki demanded that the other 2 alleged masterminds should be handed over by Syria, where they currently live. Syria refused and asked for tangible evidence for their crime. Iraq withdrew its ambassador and Syria followed suit. Others accused Iran. Mohammed al-Shahwani, the head of the Iraqi National Intelligence Service, claimed he had warned the government beforehand of the bombings. He later resigned in protest and left the country. Even as al-Maliki tries to appease citizens angered by the government's perceived failure to protect them, Iraqi authorities continued to be blamed.
The ones responsible are the politicians and the political parties, most notably the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council and other organizations who want to turn back the clock.
But the Iraqis remain angry and in a state of shock.
Hunger, oppression and sanctions, and after all this is what we get? The Iraqis from abroad live well, and we are suffering just the same.
To discuss the consequences of the security deterioration in Iraq, I am delighted to welcome from Baghdad Hoshyar Zebari, Iraq's foreign minister, and from London Sharif Ali ibn al-Hussein, the leader of the constitutional movement of Iraq, and from Washington John Nagel, president of the Center for a New American Security. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Mr. Zebari, let me start with you. Immediately after Black Wednesday, several statements were made. The most important perhaps was made by you when you said, the worst is yet to come. What did you mean by that?
Yes, thank you, Jassim. It's good to be on your program again. And as you said, actually, Wednesday, the 19th of August was a sad day in Iraq. And I think it was a turning point. The attack was at the heart of the government, at the heart of the Iraqi state. And the number of casualties were enormous. And because really that the terrorists managed to come this far, we believe that still they are preparing for more and more attacks because their goal is to bring this government down, to paralyze the government, to create as much chaos as possible. And also we have to be mindful of the foreign intervention or the regional interventions in efforts and attempts to destabilize the situation in Iraq. Some still believe, and living in the past, they believe the situation in Iraq is reversible to pre-2003. They are dreaming, actually. This will not happen. The Iraqi people, as this attacks demonstrated, are unified, are united behind the government, behind their new political regime that has been created.
Mr. Zebari, let me engage Sharif Ali ibn al-Hussein on the last sentence Mr. Zebari said, and that is, this government is united. The other statement that I was alluding to is the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, when he said immediately, I believe the day after that explosion, he said the political differences is causing this. He said the political differences is causing this. Did he put his finger on the right diagnosis, Sharif Ali bin Hussein?
Well, clearly the perception in Iraqi public opinion is that the reason for these explosions is rivalry between the different political parties. And they are using terrorist organizations to settle scores. Whether this is true or not, time will only tell. But I think it will have repercussions on the government parties. For the main reason is that the Maliki government, or the premiership of Maliki, is the main achievement is bringing security to the country. Clearly this is being severely undermined. Also, there is the accusation, as in your trailer said, that many believe that ISKI was responsible. I think whether this is true or not, perception is everything in politics, and that the Iraqi man in the street and woman in the street believes that the reason for these explosions is political rivalry between government factions, as opposed to a terrorist objective of bringing down the government and re-establishing the old regime.
Let me bring in John Nagel, who not only served in Iraq for a while, but he's also the president of the Center for New American Century. You write about Iraq. Looking at the two suspects, and that is the Ba'ath Party residing in Syria, as the Iraqi government is demanding the extradition of two senior officers of that defunct party, as well as what the chief of the Iraqi intelligence, military intelligence, Mr. Shahwani said. He says he firmly believes that it is Iran, it's Al-Qaeda trained Iran. What is your take on the two culprits?
I'm not in a good position from Washington to say which of those culprits conducted the attacks on Black Wednesday, or if in fact it was a combination, or it could have been any number of insurgent groups dedicated to achieving political objectives through the use of violence against innocent people, and particularly through the use of extraordinarily aggressive and large attacks, such as those that occurred on Black Wednesday. What I am most concerned about, frankly, is that I don't think this is the beginning of something bigger. This strikes me as a reaction to some vulnerabilities, some openings that were actually created by the Iraqi government. And I well understand the desire of the Iraqis to return to normalcy, but the insurgency is not yet over, and it is not yet time to dismantle all of the protections that have been erected over the past few years.
Exactly, that's what Mr. Zibari said immediately after the explosion. Mr. Zibari said, the worst is yet to come. We have to stop painting rosy pictures about improved security, and we have to brace ourselves for what is coming next. Exactly what is coming next, Mr. Zibari?
I don't have the crystal ball, you see, to read the future, but this is political analysis. I said in my earlier remark, Jassim, that there are a number of countries and governments around us who believe that the situation in Iraq is reversible to pre-2003. And these attacks were the signals, you see, to bring down the government or to attack the heart of the government, to create as much chaos and devastation as possible. So if they still believe in that theory, that the situation is reversible, you would expect some even worse attacks actually to be perpetrated by these terrorist groups inside Iraq.
Being the consummate politician that you are, Mr. Zibari, let me see if I can ferret out the information out of you. There were a few statements made, one of them by a senior advisor to the Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi. He said Saudi Arabia is spending millions of dollars in order to destabilize Iraq. That is one accusation, one neighboring country. And now it is no secret Iraq is asking for these two senior Iraqi Ba'athists to come back, and that is in one way or another blaming Syria for it. Am I right in assuming that Iraq is thinking that Saudi Arabia and Syria is behind this?
No, Jassim. I mean, if you followed the statement of the Iraqi politicians and ministers and parliamentarians, everybody everyone would accuse the country that fits his own political position or his flavor. There are those who accuse Iran, there are those who accuse Saudi Arabia, Syria, others, and so on. Really, we are talking here about intelligence, about evidence. Who was behind this Black Wednesday's attacks? I said from day one, from the next day almost, after seeing the footage and the videos from our closed circuit cameras about the truck, that this is an archetypal attack of Al-Qaeda. It was well organized. The executioner was a suicide bomber, and the procedures of Al-Qaeda.
Are you telling me you disagree with the Iraqi government's assessment?
You are putting words in my mouth, Johnson. No, let me finish. This is the first part. But this would not have happened without foreign assistance. I mean, this was not the work, this attack was the work of amateur Al-Qaeda or young people who would get all this material from the internet and so on. I think this was a very well organized attack. Here, what we have said, we have not accused even Syria. In fact, we said this was organized and commanded by two leading Iraqi Ba'ath members who live in Syria. And there is a background to these two cases. We have repeatedly requested them, and even there is an arrest warrant by the Interpol. They have been served red notice. So even when Prime Minister was in Damascus recently, he did raise this issue, but he didn't get any response. So here we want these two people. We believe they are responsible. There are evidence to support that. There is a background. There is a history. It is true that the Syrian told us and my colleague, the foreign minister, that even when Iraqi opposition leaders were in Damascus in the past during Saddam, we didn't hand over anyone. That's true, and we appreciate that. But the situation is different. Saddam regime was against Syria, was against the Iraqi people, against the Iraqi democratic position. We are friends to Syria. The situation is different here.
We will find out whether the Syrians, Mr. Zebari, will hand these two people. But I am puzzled. I don't know about you, Mr. Sharif Ali ibn al-Hussein. When the man responsible for intelligence, Mohammed Abdullah Shahwani, thinks it is Iran, and yet another branch of the Iraqi government says Syria, you must be lost as much as I am.
Well, I think it's most likely that in the current upsurge in violence, there are probably many players involved and many interests that are intersecting. So one has to be clear that maybe the perpetrators, the suicide bombers, the people on the ground, have their own objectives, have their own purposes for doing this. But as Foreign Minister said, it would be very unlikely that this operation wasn't supported from outside and very likely from a foreign intelligence service. And that foreign intelligence service doesn't necessarily share the same ideology as the people that the suicide bombers. So I think there's Iraq is now it's open season Iraq now for all regional countries to get involved, and each has their own agenda. So that's why it becomes very difficult to clarify who is doing what. What is clear that there is coming a campaign to destabilize the government and to undermine the security achievements, which in fact weren't very great. I think the government and the Americans' role in improving security was very limited. It was mainly because of the rise of the Sahwat awakening and the behavior of the Qaeda in Iraq. When Mr. Shahwani resigned in disgust at the government position, he clearly had intelligence that showed who was behind these campaigns, and his conscience couldn't keep him in office watching this going on. So what we have to be careful about is to believe that only one group or one ideology or one faction benefits from this upsurge in violence.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I think this will continue.
John, this next period is very important and very crucial for Iraq between now and January, when the election is going to be held. Perhaps many analysts believe that the violence will increase, and perhaps they also look that the decision by al-Maliki for a while to remove the concrete blast from certain areas was premature. To what extent the Americans might be playing a role if asked by the Iraqi government to step out of their barracks and back into the cities in order to chaperone and perhaps to shepherd this process to its final conclusion?
The United States remains committed to the security of Iraq, to the development of full democratic processes in which disputes are resolved through words and through voting and not through violence, as happened on Black Wednesday. And I think your analysis is exactly correct. I think that the government understandably wanted to take advantage of the security improvements. I think it did so somewhat prematurely, and I think that that provided an opening to the enemies of the current Iraqi government and of Iraq in general to take advantage of that lessening of security. And I think that this is an important lesson. I think if this lesson is analyzed correctly, fully digested, and leads to greater security measures, smarter security measures by the Iraqi government, greater cooperation between the United States security forces and the Iraqi government, that spirit and that cooperation can minimize the chances that something like this happens again. The insurgency is not over. We're not out of the woods. The United States remains willing, dedicated to preventing things like this from happening. We're ready to work hand in hand with the Iraqi government, whichever government it is, in order to stop things like this from happening.
Sharif Ali ibn al-Hussein alluded to the awakening, and we know that al-Maliki government has included perhaps about 10 to 15,000 of those fighters. They played a tremendous role in reversing the violence and kicking al-Qaeda out of certain areas of Iraq. How wise is it for al-Maliki to be reluctant for the inclusion of the rest of them, John Nagel?
I would prefer to see a greater pulling in of the members of the Sawa, the members of the Awakening, into the Iraqi government. There's a saying in the United States, hold your friends close and your enemies closer. Best of all, to hold your former enemies very, very close indeed. Bring them inside the tent. Provide them with an opportunity to contribute to the development of a free and a secure Iraq. And I think there is more that can be done to build on the 15,000 who have already been incorporated and to use that talent, that dedication to build a better Iraq rather than holding them at arm's length and perhaps encouraging them to resume former insurgent tactics.
Mr. Zibari, in light of what happened, do you see a situation where the Iraqi government might be asking the Americans to come back for their help?
No, Jassim. The government is pretty confident that it will be able to rise to the new security challenges. Yes, there are security breaches, vulnerabilities. We have to reconsider our policies. But really, this will not lead for the American to come back. I think under the agreement of the withdrawal, the American can be more helpful and provide more coordination and assistance in terms of the intelligence, in terms of the coordinations, of the training, of capacity building, of not being too legalistic, let's say, in the terms under this agreement, because the enemy is the same.
In light of what you also said, and that is the Iraqi security was penetrated, there was some elements of the Iraqi security, they were in cahoot with those who exploded those bombs.
Well, this is what we mean by security breaches, Jassim. You see, definitely. I mean, there has been an arrest of nearly 10, 11 security officers to investigate with them why this negligence, why they allowed these trucks to move through Baghdad while there are clear-cut instructions by the government not to allow any trucks to enter these areas, or sensitive areas. So there must be some collusion. This doesn't mean that the government is colluding with the terrorists, as some of the media have presented. No, in fact, there could be some rotten people, some people who have been penetrated, the police, the army, the traffic police, you see, that have been linked to this organization.
But also there was a premature celebration, Sharif Ali ibn al-Hussein, because Mr. Zibari himself objected to the removal of those concrete blasts around his ministry, and yet they were removed. So is it premature to say that Iraq is out of the woods, Mr. Sharif Ali ibn al-Hussein?
Well, clearly it is. I mean, we still have a long way to go to get to anything like normal security levels. I think what happened was we've missed an opportunity of about 2 years in which there was improved security levels to engage in political dialogue and to build on the achievements of the last 2 years or of 2 years ago. If one recalls, the surge main objective was to give the opportunity for a reconciliation, to bring in groups of people that felt they had been excluded from the political process. Unfortunately, over the last 2 years, that has not happened. It has been downgraded as a priority. Those that fought Al-Qaeda and turned against them and tossed them out have not been rewarded by participation in the political process. In fact, it's been very clear that it's very reluctant to get them involved. So there is a danger that the disillusionment will once again continue to spread amongst those that turned against violence and attempted to get involved in the political process. Furthermore, there is a great risk that there will be a return of sectarianism in the country. I think after the terrible, terrible attacks on Black Wednesday, there were a lot of political chatter about how these are Sunni extremists and these are Saddamis, and when one says Saddamis in Iraq, by implication it means Sunnis want to return to Iraq and re-establish. So there is a
You brought me to the very last question to this episode, to John Nagel, before I close up with Mr. Zibari. Please comment on what Sharif Ali ibn al-Hussein, and that is the specter of the return of the sectarian infighting in Iraq.
I am very concerned that that may in fact happen if the right steps are not taken. So the attacks of Black Wednesday are a reminder that progress and security in Iraq remain fragile, that the Iraqi government has real responsibility, that the Iraqi people have responsibility, and that the United States is also very willing to continue to carry its burden to help Iraq build a more secure and a more peaceful future. But we all have to cooperate together to make that happen. Most of all, we have to realize that the insurgency is not yet over, that the danger remains, and that we all have to work together to prevent attacks like this from ever happening again. Final comment from Mr. Zibari. We are not out of danger. Go ahead.
No, definitely. Still, there are some serious challenges, security and political. Remember, as you mentioned in your program, Iraq is heading toward a crucial, critical general election in January 2010. This election would be the most important election in the history of Iraq since its creation. That's why there would be a fierce competition politically inside, I mean, within the political parties, and also regional. There is a fierce regional competition how to impact the outcome of this election. So that's why this is a suitable ground for unfortunately more violence and more tension. And that's why we, the Iraqi, in fact, have the key responsibility to rise up to these challenges, to strengthen our unity and to focus, let's say, and to call on all those, you see, who believe in democracy, in the political process, to participate, you see. This is the way forward for Iraq.
Hoshyar Zibari, Sharif Ali ibn al-Hussein, John Nagel. Gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
Thank you.
To watch the show online and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, have a great week.